See no deficit, hear no deficit, speak no deficit. Welcome to election 2010. Tonight, whoever wins the election will have to bring in the biggest cuts for a generation. The writing's on the wall, so why do none of the political leaders want to tell us exactly what they'll chop? We are joined by the economic spokesman of the three main UK parties. The SNP went to court today to mount a challenge against their exclusion from Thursday night's prime ministerial debate. I'll be talking to the SNP leader, Alex Salmond. Is Labour trying to reboot its campaign by sending Gordon Brown walkabout?
Here you can see the problem of having walkabouts. Mr. Brown gets criticised if he doesn't meet real people, but if he tries to, well, this is what you get. I tell you what, in there, in the middle of that scrum, is only for the really brave.
Meanwhile, Michael Crick is testing the response to the Tories' latest slogan.
Slogan of yours, the big society, a bit confused.
Well, if you come in here, you'll see the big society in action. Don't be a cynic, Michael, it's a great thing.
And especially for Newsnight, the creators of Yes Minister bring back Sir Humphrey to scrutinise the manifestos. Tonight, the Lib Dems.
It's a wonderful phrase, when resources allow. It's up there with when the time is right.
Good evening. The political parties are oh so reluctant to challenge each other on the parlous state of the country's finances because none of them is willing to detail what they will cut. But cut they will. The Institute for Fiscal Studies estimates that real terms cuts of tens of billions of pounds will be needed over the next Parliament, whichever party wins. But where? Infrastructure, welfare, education, NHS, despite pledges of protected areas, defence. The list goes on. But the IFS say all of the parties are depriving voters of an informed choice by failing to spell out the details of the cuts they'll have to make. Here's our economics editor, Paul Mason.
Painless. That's the word the parties at Westminster want you to believe when you think about the budget deficit. It'll be reduced by half, mainly through efficiency savings. Today, we got evidence to the contrary. We always knew that beneath the squeaky clean accounts of how the parties were going to bring down the deficit, there was another grubby, indeed frightening place they never wanted us to go. But today, we got a glimpse of it. For all the sound and fury between the parties, a report today puts the differences between their plans into perspective. Spray it on a wall in Dayglow, legally, and stuff they're not telling you about suddenly becomes clear. This graph is about the budget deficit, and what it shows are the three parties' rival plans to get the government's annual overspend down. As you can see, the Tories start early this year, and they move faster, and they achieve it quicker. But when it comes to the national debt, it's a different story. The lines projected by the parties' plans are virtually the same. In fact, they all meet their target, 40% of GDP, in the same year.
The budget set out what the Treasury thinks is the necessary reduction in the deficit over the next 7 years. And neither the Liberal Democrats or the Conservatives have really disagreed with the total size of the tightening that's needed. The Conservatives had said that they want to start slightly sooner and finish slightly sooner than either Labour or the Liberal Democrats. But really, in terms of the total amount of borrowing that will happen over the next few years, the differences are very small between all three parties.
Where there is a difference is in the mix between tax rises and spending cuts. The IFS report shows that while all parties rely heavily on cuts, the Tories rely the most. Labour and the Lib Dems would raise more taxes to plug the gap. This is the crucial graph. It shows you the cuts the parties have to make to achieve their plans. The dark bits are the cuts they've announced already. The light bits, the cuts they don't want to tell us about. And when it comes to figures, for the Lib Dems 34 billion, Labour 44 billion, Tories 52.5 billion of unannounced spending cuts.
For the Conservatives, they've said they wouldn't cut spending in the NHS and they wouldn't cut overseas aid, which means that they need to find those £52 billion worth of savings from other budgets. So they're looking for perhaps £1 in every 5 out of other budgets. The government have said that they would protect spending on education and on the NHS for 2 years, but they could then start to cut those budgets after that, meaning they're looking for something like £1 in every 8 in other areas. The Liberal Democrats haven't pledged to protect any areas except overseas aid, so they have perhaps the easiest task of finding cuts. They're looking for about £1 in every 11 of the available budgets.
The IFS report provoked a little bit of a street-fighting mood between Labour and the media. The hacks reeled off a list of cuts suggested by the Financial Times that look unavoidable.
If you give us a chance, if you give us a...
You don't want to talk about we're not talking about the issues when you're not...
Adam, you're not standing for election either, I don't think.
No, I'm
so
not.
if you'd allow the politicians just to... if you allow the politicians just to give an answer...
I want you to answer the question. Which of those are you not going to do in reality?
And here's another question. Why have the parties been so swift to rule out tax increases? One think tank today produced a number that, if true, would go a long way to plug the deficit gap they all share.
Well, on the big economic issue of this election, we're being told that there's no alternative to an agenda of cuts and more cuts. But we think there is. We've looked at weaknesses in the tax system, and through a combination of closing tax loopholes, collecting outstanding amounts of tax, and looking at where people are using clever techniques of avoidance, we think we could relatively easily raise at least 50 billion.
The scale of the cuts planned mean it could be a tough 5 years for defence, for universities, for councils. And what the parties are asking us for is a mandate to take tough action. But if the IFS is right, we only know a fraction of what they're really planning to do. Economics is supposed to throw light on the murky world of public finance, and there's no shortage of economists in the three main parties. But it looks like on May the 6th, we'll be getting a choice between economists with the truth.
Paul Mason, I'm joined now by Philip Hammond, the Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Vince Cable, Treasury spokesman for the Lib Dems, and in our Birmingham studio, Liam Byrne, Chief Secretary of the Treasury. Also with me is Robert Choate of the IFS. Well, according to the IFS, Phil Hammond, you've got the most to do, and you're going to have to do most of it through cuts. 52.5 billion, you've only accounted for 18%. What are you going to cut?
Well, the reason you say we've got to do the most of it through cuts is because we've made a conscious decision that the ratio of spending cuts to tax increases should be about 4 to 1, and we've done that for a reason. A study of the most successful fiscal consolidations of recent years suggests that that is the appropriate ratio. We believe that the UK is already a very highly taxed country, and that's why we've said
80% cuts to 20% tax. Where are the cuts going to fall? You've given us 17%.
We've set out some of the areas that we will expect to cut. We've, for example, we've said there will have to be a public sector pay freeze in 2011. But look, the problem that we've got, all of us, outside government, is that the government, which has all the information, has not published a comprehensive spending review, something which the IFS today has said lies at the root of the problem.
Liam Byrne, why didn't you publish a spending review? After all, you have all the figures.
Well, for a very simple reason, which is that the assumptions that you need to lock down are in huge flux. I'll give you a very simple example. When we did the budget in 2009, we had to project unemployment at about 2.4 million. At the budget this year, we projected unemployment much lower, 700,000 lower. Now, the effect of that was that there was £14 billion available that you didn't need to provision for unemployment,
so just let's be
which
clear,
you could actually make available for departments.
Let's
so we're not going to indulge.
You have got to find more than 40 billion. You've only announced 13%. So in a sense, you're almost as in a bad a boat as Philip Hammond. You are not being honest with the electorate. And if anything is needed in this election, it's honesty.
Well, there's 2 points here. I mean, remember, the IFS are projecting out to about 2016-17, so not just over the next Parliament, but into the Parliament after that. So what we've done is set out plans to halve the deficit, bringing the structural deficit down to about 1.8% by the end of the next Parliament. And we've said, look, that's going to take about £57 billion worth of decisions.
Yes,
we've said 19
billion
needs to come from tax. Been very upfront about that. It's not easy going into an election.
So nearly 30 billion from cuts, and we don't know those cuts. Vince Cable, you at least...
38 billion from cuts.
Exactly,
and we've set out
38 billion from
and
cuts.
we've set out the first 20 billion by 2012-13. Half of about 4.4 billion comes from pay and pensions reform. About 5 billion comes from delaying lower priority programmes.
Well, we'll talk about those lower priority programmes in a moment.
Big shake-up of Whitehall.
Now, Vince Cable, you would set yourself up as being somebody that is actually doing better than the others, and as much as you've got less to find, you've only got 34 billion to find, and you have marked out 25%. Unfortunately, that leaves 75% unaccounted for.
Well, I think as Liam explained, we're committing ourselves within this Parliament rather than over two. But as you acknowledge, and as the IFS acknowledged, we've gone rather further in identifying specific cuts rather than this rather lazy assumption, which the IFS are very critical of, that you can deal with these things through efficiency. We've identified 15 billion, of which 5 go into spending commitments. That's 10 billion net. And we also specify things which we haven't put numbers on because you can't. But if you're talking about having a comprehensive defence review, for example, big defence contracts will have to be stopped. But until there's been a proper strategic, you can't identify the specifics of that.
Sorry, carry on.
You're talking about this Parliament. Your proposals are back-end loaded, so you're going to have to find more in the next Parliament.
We're talking about halving the structural deficit
let's
over this Parliament, which is a realistic assumption.
Robert, you've been listening to this. It is actually realistic not to expect parties in a general election to detail every single cut they're going to make.
No, that's reasonable enough, but I think if the voters are going to make an informed choice between what's on offer from the parties, they need as clear a picture as we can have. And as the point's been mentioned, it's basically the fact that the government has not had a spending review ahead of the election that explains how they would cut up the cake.
But that's not a justification as far as you're concerned.
Well, I think if you had done that, then it would hold the other parties' feet to the fire. Now, Liam Burns says that you can't do that because the world is uncertain. The world is still going to be uncertain in the autumn, and therefore, we're not going to be, these uncertainties are not going to be cleared up by then.
Well,
uncertainty should be confronted,
let's just try and clear up one at least. I mean, the Financial Times listed a whole section. You heard Adam Bolton trying to talk to Peter Mandelson about it earlier. Let's just deal with one area for saving money. Means testing child benefit. Now, Vince Cable, you talked about this before the election campaign began, but it wasn't in your manifesto.
That's correct.
Let's deal with this one. Can you rule out means testing child benefit in the first Parliament?
I can't rule anything out, but we're not arguing for that. We argue that we should restrict child tax credit as opposed to child benefit. An existing means tested benefit should be restricted to people on middle and low incomes, not at the higher end of 55.
Well, let's deal with you, Philip Hammond, on that.
Yes, we have made a decision to rule out means testing child benefit.
Why?
Because it's a universal benefit, and
rich people don't need it.
Talking to people, one of the things that they really appreciate about child benefit is that it's universal, easily understood.
In a
and
time
to
of
start
economic...
to means test it would erode it. Now, this is all about making priorities, decisions about priorities.
So why should people who are rich get child benefit?
Because we think the universality of child benefit is very important to people. It reassures them about the availability of the benefit, and if you start means testing it, if you start slicing away at that universality, people will fear that where are you going to stop? Where's it going to end?
And as far as you're concerned, Liam Byrne, let's have an answer on child benefit. Means testing child benefit ruled in or ruled out?
No, I agree with Philip's position on this, both in principle and in theory. And the difficulty that Philip has got is that they projected about 400 million in savings from cutting back on child tax credits. Actually, in order to deliver that number, they've got to take child tax credits off a much bigger chunk of families.
Let's be clear about this, Liam Byrne. You said you agreed with Phil Hammond. Can I just be absolutely clear that if a Labour government was in any position of power, you would not means test child benefit the whole of the next Parliament?
That's correct.
Robert Chilwell, there you have at least an answer from the Conservatives and Labour on child benefit, on means testing child benefit.
We're not arguing for means testing child benefit.
You're not arguing for it, but you're not ruling it out.
Of course, I'm trying to be responsible and acknowledge that we've got a serious problem and we're going to have to look at everything. That's all I'm saying.
So, well, Liam, when you talk about lesser priorities with a kind of sleight of hand, what would be a lesser priority? Would it be Crossrail? I mean, give us a lesser priority that will have to go by the board.
Well, in the pre-budget report back in November, we said here's £20 billion worth of savings that we want to deliver by 2012-13. And as I was just saying, about 4.4 billion comes from holding down public sector pay and asking public service workers to contribute a little bit more to their pension. We've then said 11 billion needs to come from a huge shake-up of Whitehall, outsourcing a lot more back offices, changes to the way that we buy things, changes to IT. We've then said that there's about 5 billion of just straight cuts to lower priority programmes. So,
which are?
Well, a good example is 1.4 billion in DWP programmes that we don't think need to continue.
OK, let me just put this to Robert Shaw. 1.4 billion efficiency savings, backroom cuts. We've heard it all before.
Well, I think there's clearly a distinction between cutting programmes that you actually think do good, but they just don't do enough good to justify the money in times of difficulty, and efficiency savings. Now, if you take efficiency savings at face value, it's suggesting that this is waste, that these are painless cuts. Now, presumably, any responsible government would be trying to make those efficiency savings, whether we were cutting spending or not. So the idea that you can treat them as a contribution to the cut, I think, should be taken with a little scepticism.
What struck me in your report today is you've made the assumption, I understand why it's an economics-based report, that all parties, whichever party is in office, will be able to achieve these efficiency savings. But this is an election, and what the electorate are being offered is 3 different, essentially, management teams, and they have to make a decision about who is going best.
But only if they know what the management programme is.
But they have to make a decision about which team, which party is going to be able most effectively to reduce public spending while protecting frontline public services.
Isn't the problem with all you as politicians, if I could just, because we don't have much time, all the problems with politicians, we've already had this great failure of confidence in politics because of the expenses scandal. And now we're hearing tonight the figures from the IFS which show that none of you is detailing anything like the amounts of cuts you're going to have to make. So what might happen 2 years down the line? What might happen 2 years down the line? Is the electorate's going to say, you know, we've been defrauded. We've been defrauded again.
Well, that's precisely why we have tried to be specific about 15 billion of cuts, some of them very controversial.
But 15 billion is so it is a drop in the ocean.
It isn't a drop in the
ocean. Some of them
it is not enough, and we fully acknowledge that, but it is a very substantial step towards it. The big distinction, and the IFS made this point very clearly, that relying on efficiency savings is a cop-out. I mean, it is fundamentally dishonest. And David Cameron himself made this point quite recently. He described it as a trick, and it is a trick. It's not dealing with the need for cuts of a specific
kind. You've got £4.6 billion that's supposed to come from clamping down on tax avoidance.
Yes,
the guy
absolutely.
who ran the Inland Revenue's anti-avoidance operation until 2009 has said that that's just not
because he wasn't doing his job. The Inland Revenue have said there is 40 billion that they could be getting and aren't.
Robert, when you hear this, without any specifics, is this going to give the electorate any confidence, do you think?
I'm not sure it is. I think we've obviously heard about the efficiency savings before. That was a driving issue through the last election campaign. Peter Gerson's famous review, which the government relied upon to deliver savings, the National Audit Office, still years after the event, doesn't say we can believe what was produced from that. As Philip says, I mean, it's, you know, people ought to be encouraged to deliver these efficiency savings, and you are looking for people who will manage that. But even after the event, it's very hard to verify whether they were there.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed. Well, the SNP has taken their battle to be part of Thursday's Prime Ministerial debate to the Court of Session in Edinburgh, challenging the BBC's decision not to include the Scottish nationalists and Plaid Cymru. The leader of the SNP, Alex Salmond, who will be joining us now, called the discussion a democratic outrage. The hearing has been adjourned until the morning, and the SNP leader, Alex Salmond, is in Edinburgh. Alex Salmond, first of all, good evening. If you lose at the Court of Session tomorrow, will that be the end of the matter?
No. Obviously, we hope to win, in which case the BBC could try to get back to its old procedures of being democratic and balanced across the political parties. But there are 2 aspects to what we're asking the court to do. One is for a judicial review, which is to look at the detail of making this decision and how the BBC should cope with political debate in a world in which the SNP is the government of Scotland and Plaid Cymru share government in Wales. So that is a matter which might take some considerable time before the court. And the second thing is we're asking for an interim interdict. We're asking for an interdict against the programme to be broadcast on Thursday, unless, of course, the BBC bring forward suggestions for how they can make that programme democratic and balanced, or provide a further debate in which the SNP and Plaid Cymru get to take part.
Well, let's leave that to the court tomorrow. You've just been perhaps listening to our conversation about cuts. All the parties tonight talking about spending cuts. No matter the outcome of the election, there will have to be spending cuts in Scotland, won't there?
Well, we published last Thursday from the government, I'm talking about the Government of Scotland, the report from our Chief Economic Advisor, which basically agrees with what the Institute of Fiscal Studies is saying today, and that identified that our interpretation of the budget from the Chancellor last month, what the Treasury wouldn't do, is over the next 15 years or so, It looks at £250 billion of cuts across the spending departments of the United Kingdom and about £25 billion lost public spending
so there will be
in
pain
Scotland,
in Scotland.
Over that period. Yes, there will, under the plans of, I think, the Labour Party, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. What we intend to do this Thursday, as an SNP, as a political party, is to publish how we would address that question, the very question that's been dodged by all of the London parties, and set out exactly our alternative prospectus, what we hope that people in Scotland will vote for. And incidentally, Kirsty, if I do get on to the economic debate on Thursday, I'll be delighted to spell it out to viewers across the United Kingdom in Birmingham in the BBC debate.
You have said repeatedly you want a balanced parliament at Westminster. I mean, you presumably then want SNP MPs to act as a kind of pressure group, in a sense, hawking yourself to the highest bidder rather than forming any coalition.
Well, that's a pretty pejorative way to put it, but certainly you're right, we will not form a coalition with either the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. So there's no prospect of the SNP and Plaid Cymru doing that. But as you know, the SNP have more experience than anybody across these islands in running a balanced parliament. I've been First Minister of a minority government for the last 3 years, and this can be a very cooperative process. For example, very quickly, we cooperated with the Liberal Democrats to abolish tuition fees in Scotland. We cooperated with the Conservative Party to put 1,000 extra police in the streets of Scotland, and we cooperated with the Labour Party in order to introduce 20,000 modern apprenticeships in Scotland. Now, each of these votes depended on one of the other parties backing the minority government, and that's the productive sort of politics that can come from having a balanced parliament if people have the imagination to use it properly.
But at Westminster then, presumably by extension, there is no party you wouldn't vote with if it was advantageous to you?
Well, our priority will be to defend the interests of Scotland and Wales and to promote the interests of Scotland and Wales, yes.
If you could, as it were, leverage some advantage for Scotland, for example, you could see a possibility of SNP MPs voting on English issues, perhaps determining an NHS policy in England, something that the MPs from Scottish parties have not been doing until now. But in the possibility of a balanced parliament, you could see SNP MPs voting for an English piece of legislation.
Well, can I just correct you slightly? Other parties in Scotland have been doing that, of course, and the Labour MPs in Scotland voted quite disgracefully, in my view, to impose tuition fees on English students in England, top-up fees. The SNP voted against that because there was a budgetary implication for Scotland. But you're quite right. I mean, I think we'd have to review our general attitude. But can I say to you that the things that we'll tend to vote on will be on the progressive side of politics. You know, one of our great aims is to see the end of any talk of spending £100 billion on a new Trident missile system while public service is under pressure. We'll try to advance the causes of our nations, but it'll be on the progressive side of politics.
Yeah, you say that now, and in all good faith, you say it would be on the progressive side of politics, but there may be something that you dearly want that means that you will have to, as it were, mandate your SNP MPs to vote in a particular way, and it may not be on the progressive side of politics if it is advantageous to Scotland.
Well, the more SNP and Plaid Cymru MPs there are, the more progressive forces there'll be in the Westminster Parliament. I mean, basically, Kirsty, in previous times, we'd have had much more in common with the Labour Party's attitude to things than the Conservative Party. But it is very difficult from our vantage point to tell a huge amount of difference between these two parties now. It's very, very difficult indeed. And I suppose there are some aspects of what the Conservatives are saying which would be even more damaging than what the Labour Party are saying. For example, the suggestion from the Conservatives that they would tear up the funding settlement for Scotland without the consent of the Scottish Government or the Scottish people. You know, that's a particular Cameron cut aimed at Scotland, which incidentally is destroying the Conservative prospects of making any advance in Scotland in this campaign.
Alex Cameron, thank you very much.
Great pleasure, thank you.
Of course, it's not just the SNP standing in Scotland at the general election. In addition to the main Westminster parties, there are 3 other parties contesting a significant number of constituencies. And here's a summary of their views.
And work hard for people in Scotland at Westminster level.
The Scottish Green Party launched their manifesto last week, highlighting the need for a transformation in the economy, society and politics. They called on voters to send a fresh and radical voice to Parliament. They're contesting 20 seats in Scotland. Their key objectives are a living wage for all, to protect public services and to support new green jobs. The Scottish Socialist Party argues that an independent socialist Scotland is needed and asks for no cuts, no wars and an end to corruption. They say they are the party that dares to be different. They're contesting 10 seats in Scotland. Their key manifesto pledges are for a green socialist republic, to clean up the Westminster mess and to withdraw troops from Afghanistan.
My name is Philip Stott from the Trade Unions and Socialist Coalition.
The Scottish Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition is contesting 10 seats across Scotland. One of its co-conveners is the former MSP Tommy Sheridan. The party stands for stopping public sector cuts for bank bailouts, scrapping Trident and public ownership, not private profit. Well, Labour's campaign had a change of direction today. Peter Mandelson took charge of the shop, as we saw earlier, while Gordon Brown was sent out and about in the streets of Glasgow. Our political correspondent David Grossman joins us now. David, is this a sign that there's a bit jitters going on in the Labour camp?
I think it's safe to say that there are jitters in the Labour camp on two scores, Kirsty. Firstly, there's worries about how the Prime Minister is connecting with voters, but privately, Labour insiders will tell you there's not much that can be done about that at this stage of the campaign. But secondly, the strategy behind the Labour campaign is giving cause for concern, and the situations that the Prime Minister is being put in. At the weekend in Corby, we saw the most bizarre spectacle of the Prime Minister appearing alongside an Elvis impersonator. He looked very uncomfortable, as I think would anyone standing alongside a gentleman in a sequin jumpsuit. However, the Labour are complaining that journalists simply don't want to discuss policy, to which I think journalists would argue yes and no. Yes, I think because a lot of the policy was unveiled a long time before the general election manifestos, but no, also at today's press conference we saw lots of opportunities to discuss policy politely and not so politely decline. For example, journalists wanted to know how on earth Labour intended to fill the yawning gap as identified by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, as we were hearing earlier, in the nation's finances. Then they didn't seem so keen on discussing policy. Today, the Prime Minister was campaigning in Scotland. I spent the day trying to assess how Labour's campaign is going on the ground.
Hello, how are you doing? There's always a risk for politicians visiting schools. You might be getting on very well. You might even get offered a plasticine lollipop. But then, out of nowhere, a kid with glasses and a T-shirt saying "mad as a box of frogs" on it could jump in and steal your limelight. As Mr Brown was in Stirling making friends among people who might become voters in about 2025, there were questions being asked in London about whether the Prime Minister has been demoted to a mere sideshow in his own campaign.
There's been some criticism from within the Labour Party about the lacklustre nature of your campaign, keeping the Prime Minister sidelined, using Elvis impersonators. How do you respond?
Just not possible to sideline a man like that. I mean, he is robust, ebullient, full of passion, with very strong convictions, with a very good record to share with the British people, and a great deal to say about the future of our country.
As Mr Brown left the centre in Stirling, I put the question to him.
Are you being sidelined in this campaign, sir?
OK, so no luck there. Better try someone else. Jim Murphy is the Scottish Secretary, but could perhaps try harder to destroy national stereotypes when it comes to his choice of breakfast.
That's rubbish. And I can't stop journalists asking stupid questions, and I'm just glad you came here and say that that's not happening. Gordon Brown's leading from the front. He's the captain of our team. And we're confident that people go out and vote and we have a debate about the issues rather than the soap opera of politics. I'm confident we can get a great result on May the 6th if people go out and vote.
While the Prime Minister heads off to do a radio interview, we've moved here to the centre of Glasgow, where we're told Mr Brown is going to try something that he hasn't done much of this campaign, something new. That is to get out and meet real voters face to face, to try to persuade them of Labour's message. We're going to hang around and see how he gets on.
One of the criticisms of the Labour campaign is that it's been a bit, well, stage managed, a bit safe. Today was certainly more risky.
How are you doing? Hi, Paul.
Mr Brown apparently determined to meet every voter in Scotland.
Very nice to meet you.
It's a tough ask, though. The cameras quickly envelop him.
Here you can see the problem of having walkabouts. Mr. Brown gets criticised if he doesn't meet real people, but if he tries to, well, this is what you get. I tell you what, in there, in the middle of that scrum, is only for the really brave.
Into this swirling vortex, voters are sucked in and spat out, hopefully with a photo and a tale to tell.
Did you meet him?
Yeah. Yes.
And what do you reckon?
I think he was very nice, very pleasant. Very approachable, yes.
Yeah? Should he do this more often, do you think? Get out on the street?
Oh, I think it's a good thing, yeah. It's good all round.
On the edge of the mayhem, almost unnoticed, is Labour's deputy leader, Harriet Harman.
Is this kind of event what you need to make contact with people, do you think, at this stage of the campaign?
Well, I think we're just trying to get our message across in, all around the country, Scotland, England and Wales. We're all campaigning.
All very interesting, no doubt, but there's actually a far more important question I have to ask her.
Peppa Pig, what's going on?
Oh, I don't know. You'll have to consult somebody else about Peppa Pig. I'm afraid I can't, I don't know.
Peppa Pig, you will no doubt know, is a cartoon character who, in some form as yet unspecified, had been due to make an appearance at a Labour Party event this afternoon. But fearing that she might in some way compromise the political neutrality that cartoon characters have to jealously guard, she pulled out. Thus, in the surreal world of general election campaigning, we heard serious political journalists opining on whether Peppa Pig had snubbed the PM. Meanwhile, in the only slightly less surreal world of the Glasgow walkabout, Mr. Brown is heading for his car. Mr. Brown seems pleased with his afternoon's work. Certainly happier than the drivers stuck behind his limo.
So that's it, the Prime Minister's got back in his car. Glasgow can get back to normal. In the half hour he was here, I can honestly say we didn't see anyone who wasn't genuinely pleased to see him. Having said that, we should point out that Glasgow is, of course, one of the most strongly Labour cities in the entire UK, and to adapt Frank Sinatra, if he can't make it here, he can't make it anywhere.
David Grossman, well, when the election campaign kicked off, David Cameron's big idea was the big society. But then there was a big silence about it. Well, today in London, he restated his vision of the big society in contrast with big government and promised to tackle Britain's broken society, particularly teen violence. And then he travelled north to spread the word. Our political editor, Michael Crick, caught up with him in Bolton.
The magnificent town hall of Bolton in Lancashire, monument to the Victorian age when local mill owners felt civic responsibility to provide public services to the working class. Today, Bolton was part of David Cameron's drive for a new kind of civic responsibility to fix what he calls broken Britain. And many locals would agree there's certainly a problem.
Do you agree that we live in a broken society now?
I think so. The problem being is there's too many kids out there having kids, and don't take responsibility for their own actions.
Broken society.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that, the youths of today, and I've got teenagers myself, you know what I mean?
What do you think the answer is to all of that?
How I was brought up, you know what I mean, a cracker in the back of the head and that, that's the way it is, old-fashioned,
You say broken society about young people doing things wrong, but the majority of young people aren't that bad. Just the one or two. There's more older people probably that are worse.
In what way?
Look at Dean.
This morning in London, David Cameron delivered a big speech telling us more about his big society, what he terms his guiding philosophy.
There is, I believe, only one way out of this national crisis, and it's what I've called the big society. A society where we see social responsibility, not state control, as the principal driving force for social progress. A society where we come together and work together to solve our social problems. A society where we remember every day that we are all in this together.
The state, he said, makes social problems worse by doing too much.
This is what Barack Obama called the audacity of hope. Now it is our turn to dare to believe that we can change our world. Not on our own, but together. All of us. So I ask you, Let us come together and do it. Thank you.
He then took those themes to the northwest and to the Bolton Lads and Girls Club, a favourite Cameron stop-off point, which he feels is a good example of what he's going on about. Though many in politics, right and left, have derided his big society as a weak slogan which leaves voters bewildered.
Isn't this slogan of yours, the big society, a bit confusing?
Well, if you come in here, you'll see the big society in action. Don't be a cynic, Michael, it's a great thing.
Hundreds of teenagers pay 40 pence a day to use club facilities to avoid trouble on Bolton's streets.
What were the things that made you stop and think again and say, I'm going to put the bad times behind?
It was just work, like chances to work, bit of voluntary work with the younger people, like 16-year-olds, which is like a holiday project they have here.
Big society, what does it mean? What does big mean? I don't think people on the doorstep with 10 days to go to polling day are going to find that something necessarily easy to understand. David Cameron's problem is that the big society is packed full of detail, of policy, and he's having difficulty explaining to people what all that policy is, perhaps because there's so much of it, perhaps because it's so big.
After David Cameron's brief visit, some of the teenagers, volunteers and staff here spoke to us.
The theme of his campaign is the big society. Do you know what that means?
It's like to bring people together. They're not just trying to help one certain amount of people, they're trying to help everybody by doing like only a few things but helping everybody like together at the same time. Yeah.
You're talking about setting up schools. I think that's a vision for the future in some respects, but I think there's lots of little issues and some of the smaller issues around poor housing stock, high unemployment that needs challenging within these areas of deprivation first before you can then start off giving power out to people in that community to deliver it.
Do you think that that government needs to get smaller, central government, that the government should be doing less?
I think that the government should be doing more, is it, like, for things like rehousing and everything, because I know, like, a lot of, like, young people and everything, and, like, most of them are, like, sleeping on the streets and stuff because there's hostels and stuff like that. Yeah, there's one, like, round the corner from here, yeah, and, like, there's only a limited amount of places and everything. I know people that are, like, scrimping and scraping everything, scrounging off people because they've got nowhere to stay and everything. And I think that, like, the government should actually do more by helping people, and then possibly help with things like apprenticeships and stuff like that to make more jobs for people our age and stuff like that, because especially people with no qualifications and stuff.
Cameron's big society may well have struck a chord or two with people here, but he faces a big struggle to persuade the whole country.
Michael Craig joins us now from Leeds. Michael, just on the general struggle for votes, what are the opinion polls looking like tonight?
Well, there are three more polls tonight, Kirsty, pretty much in line with the trends of the last many days, really. YouGov's Internet Tracker poll for The Sun has the Conservatives on 33, Labour second place tonight on 29, but the Lib Dems only just behind on 28. Comres poll for ITV and The Independent, very similar figures. Conservatives 33, Labour and the Lib Dems both on 29. But Conservatives, I think, will be cheered a bit by a third poll by Populous for The Times, which has the Conservatives on 36, the Lib Dems second on 28, Labour on 27. Now, that's only the second time since the first debate on the 15th of April that the Conservatives have reached the 36% mark. Now, compare that with before the first debate, when they were regularly in the range of 38 to 41, the kind of range they need to be sure of a majority in the House of Commons, whereas all these polls tonight are still very much in the area of a hung parliament, and it's still very much a close three-horse race.
And you've also got news of donations tonight.
Yes, the Electoral Commission have released details of large donations, that's more than 7,500, made to all of the political parties in the second week of this campaign. And they show that all the parties were raising a lot more in big donations. The Conservatives raised £2.2 million, including 6 donations of more than £100,000, and £25,000 also from Warburton's The Bakers. You'll recall David Cameron visited their bakery only a few days before this donation and announced that he'd recently bought a bread maker. Labour got £1.5 million, £500,000 from the Shop Workers Union, big donations from Alan Sugar's company and from the curry entrepreneur Sir Ghulam Noon. The Liberal Democrats raised only £120,000 in big donations, including £15,000 from our old boss at the BBC, Greg Dyke.
Michael, thanks very much. Now, while our politicians traverse the country peddling pledges and promises, civil servants will be busy scouring manifestos and concocting strategies ready for whichever new minister walks through their door. The most famous of all the Whitehall mandarins is, of course, Sir Humphrey Appleby from the classic Yes Minister. And for the first time in 20 years, his creators, Sir Anthony Jay and Jonathan Lynn, have revived the great man to bring us his personal advice on making the party's proposals work. Tonight, in his second memo to the Minister, Sir Humphrey peruses the Liberal Democrat manifesto.
Little gems from the Lib Dems Party Manifesto. You never know what you might find if you look carefully. Take the Lib Dem tax on bank profits. Now look under tax and it's not there. Why? Because it's under savings. I think that's brilliant. After all, taxes are people's savings. It's just that the government spends the money for them. Perhaps the Lib Dems will introduce a whole new fiscal vocabulary. No more taxes, income savings, value-added savings, inheritance savings, capital gains savings. I'm surprised the other parties haven't thought of it. Oh. This is very good. Whoever wrote this is an expert. We could use him in the department. We will reverse the increase in national insurance contributions when resources allow. It shows you have all the right ideas, but since resources will never allow the reversal, you never actually have to do anything. It's a wonderful phrase, when resources allow. It's up there with when the time is ripe. Ah, the mansion tax. Or should that be the mansion savings? Payable at 1% of the value of any property over £2 million. Well, now that's a reasonable idea. At least it sounds reasonable, until you ask the experts about it. The Institute of Fiscal Studies say that it could slash the price of the more expensive houses, which means that it might bring in much less than they estimate. But main thing is, it sounds good. One of those Robin Hood taxes. Savings, where you take from the rich and give to the poor. The department has noted the proposal for a mansion tax and has taken it on board. It cannot, of course, be put into effect until we've completed a full survey of property values in England and Wales. And when this is completed, householders liable for the new tax will have to be informed of the revised valuation and be given 3 months' appeal against it. This will entail, of course, the appointment of an appeals inspectorate and regional valuation appeals tribunals. It should not, however, be a lengthy process. We would hope to have the system up and running within 2 or 3 parliaments. Oh, and what about this from page 50? Liberal Democrats will help protect children and young people from developing negative body images by regulating the airbrushing of adverts. Well, it takes all sorts to make a government, but how do you stop negative body images from developing? Well, I suppose we could set up the AABRNBIAA, the Advert Airbrushing Regulation and Negative Body Image Abolition Authority. Never let it be said that the civil service can't rise to a challenge.
That was Henry Goodman playing the part of Sir Humphrey Appleby, and next week he'll be casting his eye over the Labour manifesto. In a moment, a first look at tomorrow's papers, but now a roundup of today's news. Stock markets in Europe and the United States have fallen sharply in response to Greek and Portuguese debt being downgraded, and further signs the crisis in Greece is intensifying. It comes amidst increasing concern that the country will struggle to pay off its debt, despite promises by the IMF and the EU to lend it billions of pounds. Our economics editor Paul Mason joins us now. How dangerous a moment is this?
It's dangerous, Kirsty, because you've got a Eurozone government, Greece, having its debt downgraded to junk and put on negative watch, which means it might eventually not be able to pay its debts. It's dangerous because they're in the middle of an argument. The Greek government trying to maintain control, at least over a bit of what it has to do. The German government under pressure from its own electorate, placing big pressure on Greece. Some German politicians saying, go on, drive them out of the Eurozone. Now that means, of course, there is 45 billion there agreed already to help them out, but the terms of the agreement are being haggled over. There's a chance, and that's what S&P have done today. They've said there's a greater chance that while this is going on, they fall out of the system, they go bust. There's also a chance that the 45 billion is not enough. That's what Goldman Sachs said today. Now, the last problem is, it could all bleed over into the banking system. Greek debt is still held by some banks, so is Spanish, so is Portuguese, so is Irish debt, all looking more shaky. And when they can't hold that for collateral, they have to get out of it. It could infect the banking system even yet.
Well, thank you. Well, Goldman Sachs executives have been enduring a tough round of questioning from the US Senate committee in Washington over alleged fraud. The bank is accused of profiteering from the housing crisis. The star turn came from London-based Goldman banker Fabrice Touré, who masterminded a 2007 deal that's been branded as fraudulent by the Securities and Exchange Commission. He rebutted what he called unfounded attacks on his character, but admitted to errors of judgment. So how did all this affect the markets? The FTSE 100 share index closed down more than 150, a fall of over 2.5%. In New York, the Dow Jones closed down more than 200 points against the euro. The pound was slightly up. Against the surging dollar, the pound was down well over 2 cents. And tomorrow morning's front pages, and this is what we were talking about tonight, the Daily Telegraph, the story these men don't want you to read. The Independent, tell us the truth about the economy, leading think tank's message to party leaders. The Guardian, all parties dishonest on cuts, and there is that Goldman's fabulous fab faces the music. Daily Mail, secret tax bombshell, the story down the right. Police have given up on Maddie, say the McCanns. And the Sun, pig deserts sinking ship, that's Pepper abandoning the government. And finally, in the Financial Times, Tories explore pact with nationalists, that's Scotland, Plaid and perhaps Ireland, to avoid Lib Dem electoral reform. Well, that's just about all from Newsnight tonight. If we're expecting frayed tempers in the big debate on Thursday, it'll be nothing compared with the mayhem inside Ukraine's parliament this morning when they approved an agreement to allow the Russian Navy to extend its stay until 2042. Good night.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again. I'm laughing at clouds so dark up above. And the sun's in my heart and I'm ready for love. Let the stormy clouds chase everyone from the place.